Let's start. Dawn colored the Denver skyline with hues of amber as Bryce Keller's truck rolled into the construction site. The familiar aroma of fresh lumber and morning dew greeted him as he stepped out, his steel-toed boots crunching on the gravel. At 38, he carried himself with the quiet assurance of a man who had built his legacy, project by project, from the ground up. Before him stood the half-constructed framework of what would soon become the city's newest medical center, its skeletal structure stretching towards the Colorado sky. Bryce ran his hand along a support beam, searching for any imperfections in the construction. As in life, even the smallest flaw could bring everything down. "Morning, boss." Mike Reynolds, his foreman of 8 years, greeted him, holding a tablet. "The concrete delivery for the East Wing is set for 9. Thought you'd want to supervise it yourself." Bryce nodded and pulled on his work gloves. "How's the rebar crew?" "All set. Diego's team finished the framework yesterday. Want to take a look yourself?" "Always," Bryce replied, grabbing his hard hat from the truck. "A building's only as strong as its foundation, Mike. You know that." They walked the site together, Bryce inspecting every detail with the thoroughness that had made Bryce Keller Construction the most reputable name in Denver's industry. His crews were well acquainted with his standards. No shortcuts, no compromises, no excuses. A young apprentice named Tommy approached. "Mr. Keller, we found something in the east corner of the foundation. It might be a problem." Bryce followed Tommy to the site where a hairline crack ran through one section of the foundation, almost invisible to an untrained eye. But Bryce had spent 20 years learning to spot trouble before it escalated. "Get the engineering team out here," he instructed. "We're not building on uncertain ground." "But sir," Tommy hesitated. "The schedule." Bryce's tone was firm. "I don't care if we lose a day or a week. We do it right, or we don't do it at all." As the morning wore on, Bryce worked alongside his crew, teaching the newer workers how to secure support beams properly. His hands were just as calloused as any laborer's. He had never been the kind of boss who stayed in an air-conditioned office while others did the real work. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from Morgan. "Working late tonight. Don't wait up." A familiar twist of suspicion tightened in his stomach. He checked their shared calendar. Morgan had marked herself as being in court all afternoon. Strange, considering she had told him yesterday that she'd be handling paperwork at the office. "Hey, boss," Mike's voice interrupted his thoughts. "Inspector's here for the walkthrough." Bryce pocketed his phone, pushing aside his concerns about Morgan for the moment. Work required his full attention, and he had built his reputation on being present for every detail. The inspection took most of the morning, and afterward, Bryce sat in his office trailer reviewing site reports while eating the lunch he'd packed. Morgan had stopped making his lunches months ago, claiming she was too busy. A calendar notification popped up again, reminding him of her court appearance. He opened his email and found the weekly schedule from Crawford and Mills, which her boss Melinda always sent to spouses. No court appearances listed for the day. Another lie in a growing stack. His phone rang. Avery's school. "Mr. Keller, this is Mrs. Reynolds from the front office. Avery's not feeling well. Could someone pick her up?" "I'll be there in 20 minutes. He was already grabbing his keys. "We tried Mrs. Keller first, but she didn't answer." "Of course she didn't," he muttered after hanging up. He called Mike. "Handle the concrete pour. I need to get Avery." The drive to Denver Middle School gave him too much time to think. Morgan's behavior had been changing for months now. Small shifts at first. New clothes, different makeup, longer hours at the office. Each change was small enough to brush off, but together they formed a pattern he couldn't ignore. Avery was sitting in the nurse's office, her face pale but brightening when she saw him. "Dad, you came." "Always will, kiddo," he said, signing the checkout sheet. "What's wrong?" "Stomach hurts and I got dizzy." She leaned against the window, looking small in her oversized school sweatshirt. "Is Mom working late again?" "Seems like it," he answered, keeping his tone neutral. But Avery was perceptive for a 12-year-old. "She's different now," she said quietly. "Like she's not really here even when she is." Bryce reached over and squeezed her hand. "Some people, they get lost sometimes. But you've got me. That's never going to change." At home, he settled Avery on the couch with ginger ale and crackers and called to reschedule his afternoon appointments. Family had always come first, and that had been his rule. "Dad," Avery asked as he tucked a blanket around her, "are you and Mom getting divorced?" The question hit him like a misplaced hammer strike. "What makes you ask that?" Jenny's parents got divorced last year. Her mom started acting like mom is now. Always busy, never home, buying new clothes all the time. Bryce sat beside her, choosing his words carefully. I don't know what's going on with Mom right now, but I need you to know something. Whatever happens, you're my priority. Nothing's going to change that. I promise. They spent the afternoon watching cooking shows, their shared guilty pleasure. Later, Morgan called. Melinda needs me to stay late, she said distractedly. The Peterson case. Bryce cut in. School called. They couldn't reach you. Is she okay? She will be, Morgan replied. No thanks to you. Don't start, Morgan snapped. I'm working, she continued. Are you? Because Melinda's weekly schedule shows no court appearance today. Funny, since that's where you told me you'd be. Another pause, longer this time. I have to go. Client calling. She hung up before he could respond. Bryce stared at his phone, anger building like pressure in a sealed pipe. Later that night, after getting Avery to bed, he sat in his home office, reviewing Morgan's recent credit card statements. The charges told their own story: boutique clothing stores, high-end salons, a downtown hotel bar where she'd never mentioned going, small betrayals adding up to bigger ones. The front door opened just after midnight, the sound of Morgan's heels clicking against the hardwood floor. She was unsteady, her steps slightly stumbling. Bryce waited in his office, listening as she moved through the house. You're up late, she said from the doorway, her words slightly slurred. She wore a new dress, tight and black, something he had never seen before. Somebody had to be here for our daughter, he replied, keeping his voice steady. How was court? Morgan laughed, her voice dismissive. Oh, that got rescheduled. Ended up taking clients to dinner instead. Smells more like a bar than a dinner. Are you monitoring me now? She snapped. I put in a lot of effort, Bryce. I'm entitled to have drinks with coworkers, right? He stood up slowly. Is that how you refer to them? What do you mean by that? You explain it to me, Morgan. Tell me about these late nights, the new outfits, the stories about where you're going and what you're doing. She straightened, her posture now defiant, replacing the unsteady sway caused by alcohol. I don't answer to you. I'm not one of your construction workers that you can boss around. No, you're my wife, or at least you used to be. Morgan laughed bitterly. Oh, please, the devoted husband act. You spend more time with your buildings than with me. I'm investing my time in something meaningful. What are you working on, Morgan? Besides constructing a wall of lies, that is. She turned away, swaying just a little. I'm going to bed. You can sleep in the guest room if you're going to act like this. Bryce watched her walk away, his jaw tightening. In construction, you learn to spot signs of failure in structures. The small cracks that signal a bigger collapse is inevitable. Their marriage was showing every warning sign, and Morgan was the one holding the wrecking ball. The next morning, Morgan left early, claiming another court appearance. Bryce got Avery ready for school, packed her lunch, and checked her temperature. It was normal, a typical routine, except for the emptiness at the breakfast table. At the construction site, he threw himself into his work, overseeing the concrete pour for the East Wing Foundation. The physical labor helped him clear his mind, allowing him to tackle problems methodically. Looking solid, Boss Mike remarked, as they checked the setting concrete. No weak spots, unlike some things, Bryce muttered. Mike paused, then spoke carefully. Everything all right? You seem tense lately. Bryce straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead. Have you ever built something, put everything into making it perfect, only to watch someone else tear it down? Can't say that I have. Hope you never do. In the afternoon, while reviewing supplier contracts in his office trailer, Bryce's phone buzzed with a text from Morgan. Don't wait up tonight. Big client event. He double-checked Melinda's weekly schedule. Nothing listed. Another lie to add to the pile. Later, picking Avery up from soccer practice, he watched his daughter dribble fiercely down the field. She had his drive, his determination, his unwillingness to give up. She'd need that strength for what was coming. Dad! She ran over, her cleats kicking up grass. Did you see my goal? Sure did, sweetheart. You're getting stronger every day. In the truck, Avery was unusually quiet. After a while, she asked, Is Mom coming to my game Saturday? She said she would. But both of them knew that Morgan's promises had become as unreliable as shifting sand. At home, while Avery worked on her homework, Bryce found himself in the master bedroom going through Morgan's things. He hated doing it. It felt like a betrayal of trust, but trust, like a solid foundation, had to be earned. In her dresser drawer, buried under silk scarves she never wore, he found a burner phone. The messages on it made his blood run cold. Talks about meetings at hotels, parties at private clubs, and things that made him want to punch a wall. But rage wouldn't help. In construction, you needed a clear mind to fix problems. He photographed everything, documenting every betrayal, every lie, then carefully put everything back exactly as it had been. That weekend, Morgan missed Avery's soccer game, claiming food poisoning. Bryce sat alone in the bleachers, watching their daughter score 2 goals and scan the crowd at halftime for a mother who wouldn't show. "She's really good," another parent commented. "Takes after you, doesn't she?" "In more ways than one," Bryce replied, thinking about his daughter's growing distrust of her mother's excuses. The next week brought more late nights, more lies, more proof of Morgan's double life. Bryce collected it all, storing it away, building his case piece by piece, just as he would a house, methodically and thoroughly, leaving no weak spots. Then came the invitation. He found it while searching for a pen in Morgan's purse. She had left it on his desk while printing something, a heavy cream-colored paper with gold lettering that caught the light. "Aline Knights cordially invites you." The rest was intentionally vague, but something about the wording raised red flags. Having seen enough contracts, Bryce knew when someone was hiding the true meaning behind fancy words. "What are you doing?" Morgan stood in the doorway, her face tight with suspicion. "Looking for a pen," he replied, holding up the invitation. "What's this?" "Just a work thing. A mixer," she said quickly, crossing the room to snatch the invitation from his hand. "Team-building event at a place called Illusion Nights. It's a new venue." She smiled, but it was forced, fake. "Very corporate, very boring. You wouldn't be interested." Bryce leaned back in his chair, studying her. The new highlights in her hair caught the office light. The fitted dress she wore probably cost more than he spent on work clothes in a year. Everything about her was different now, polished, perfected, artificial. "When is it?" "Friday," she replied, already turning away. "I'll probably be late, so don't wait up." After she left, Bryce opened his laptop and searched for Aline Knights. The website was minimalist and exclusive, but in construction, you learn to look past the glamorous facade to the underlying structure. A few deep searches revealed the truth. It was a private club known for hosting certain types of parties that ruined marriages. Friday morning, he woke to find Morgan already in the bathroom, spending extra time on her makeup. She had laid out a dress on the bed that made his jaw tighten, all straps and skin. Nothing like the woman he had married. "Avery's got a dentist appointment at 4, he reminded her over breakfast. "Can you make it?" Morgan didn't look up from her phone. "Oh, honey, I forgot to tell you. I've got that mixer tonight. It's mandatory attendance." She gathered her things quickly. "You can handle the dentist, right? You're much better at that stuff anyway." The casual dismissal of their daughter stung, but Bryce kept his face neutral. "Sure, I got it covered." Morgan kissed Avery on the head. "Be good for your dad, sweetie. Don't forget to floss." After she left, Avery pushed her cereal around her bowl. "Mom's different now," she said softly. Bryce sat beside her, choosing his words carefully. "What makes you say that?" "She doesn't listen anymore. Not really." Avery looked up at him with eyes that were too wise for a 12-year-old. "And she smells different, like new perfume." That day at work, Bryce could barely focus. Every hammer strike, every saw cut seemed to echo with his rising anger. But he channeled it, using it to push him forward, to plan his next moves carefully. "Mr. Keller," his secretary poked her head into the trailer. "Your wife called. She said she forgot to mention she has another late meeting next week. Asked me to put it on your calendar." "Did she say where? Some client dinner? Want me to get the details?" Bryce shook his head. "No need. I already know she's lying." The secretary's face softened with understanding. "I'm sorry, sir." "Don't be. Just make sure it's on my calendar." After dropping Avery off at her friend's house for a sleepover that evening, Bryce parked his truck outside Aline Knights, a club located in a posh area of Denver. The entrance was marked by subtle lighting and a discreet sign. Definitely not the type of venue where corporate team-building events would take place. As he waited, he observed other cars arriving, bringing couples dressed for a very different kind of event than what Morgan had described. His grip on the steering wheel tightened until his knuckles were white. At 8:15, Morgan showed up in an Uber. She had changed from her work attire into something that made Bryce's stomach churn, a revealing dress and heels higher than what she had ever worn to work. She laughed with a group of strangers, one of them touching her arm as they headed inside. Part of him wanted to storm in, confront her, and tear the place apart. But that wasn't his approach. In construction, you needed a solid plan before demolition. So, he used the time to remotely access Morgan's laptop. She had never changed the password he'd set up years ago when he bought it for her. What he found chilled him. Messages, photos, and arrangements. Proof the mixer was a swingers' party, and it wasn't her first time. She had been living a double life, slowly tearing apart everything they had built together. At 2 a.m., Morgan left the club with 3 men. Even from a distance, Bryce could see she was disheveled. Smudged makeup, messy hair, and unsteady on her feet as she laughed at something one of the men said. They helped her into an Uber, their hands lingering too long. Bryce started his truck, his decision now made. Tomorrow, everything would change. Morgan had just destroyed their world, and now he would make sure she felt the consequences. The drive home was a blur of streetlights and cold determination, each mile reinforcing his resolve. In construction, you learned that sometimes the only way to fix a compromised structure was to tear it down and rebuild. He spent the rest of the night in his office, carefully collecting evidence. Morgan's laptop provided more than he expected. Email threads, photo attachments, and hotel receipts charged to their joint account. She hadn't even tried to hide it well, likely confident she could talk her way out of his suspicions. At dawn, he heard her Uber pull up. Morgan's heels clicked unsteadily on the walkway. The front door opened and shut. Bryce waited in the shadows of his office, listening to her fumble with her keys. Her voice rang out from the bottom of the stairs, surprised to find the office light still on. "You're up early." He didn't answer. He let her approach. Morgan appeared in the doorway, still wearing that dreadful dress, her makeup smeared despite her attempts to fix it, and her hair, once styled for the party, now told the tale of where she'd been and what she'd done. "The Peterson case ran late," she began, her voice slipping into the familiar excuses. "We had to stop." His voice was quiet, but it carried weight. "Just stop." Something in his tone made her hesitate. Her eyes fell on the laptop screen, open to her emails. The color drained from her face. "You went through my private—" "Private?" he interrupted. "Like the private party at Alean Nights? The private meetings with those 3 men? The private hotel rooms you've been charging to our account?" Morgan's composure faltered for just a moment before she tried to regain it. "You followed me. You left a trail even a blind man could follow." He turned the laptop toward her. "Want to see the pictures? The messages? The receipts for all the things you bought to impress your new friends?" "Bryce, I can explain," she said, her voice pleading. "Can you explain it to Avery?" he asked, his voice rising slightly. "Can you explain to our 12-year-old daughter why her mother would rather spend time with strangers than attend her soccer games?" Morgan's face hardened. "Don't bring her into this. You brought her into it the moment you decided to destroy this family." He shot back, his anger growing. "Oh, please," she retorted, her shock replaced with anger. "This self-righteous act doesn't suit you. So I had some fun, explored a little. I'm not dead just because I'm married." Bryce's laugh was cold. "Fun? Is that what you call betraying every value I had? Breaking up our family?" His words hit her like a sledgehammer. "I had sex with 3 guys, she said defiantly. "So what? You're overreacting." "Get out." The words hung in the air like a forceful blow. "Get out of my office. Get out of my house." His voice remained calm, but his control was unmistakable. "You've got 30 minutes to pack what you need for today. The rest we'll sort out through lawyers." "You can't be serious," she said, doubt creeping into her voice. "This is my house too." "A house you helped destroy," he countered. He glanced at his laptop. 29 minutes now. He looked back at her. "Morgan, you've just burned your world to the ground. Watch me make sure you feel the flames." She stared at him, possibly seeing the full consequences of her actions in his unwavering gaze. Then she turned and fled to their bedroom, her former bedroom. Bryce listened as she hurriedly packed, the sound of drawers opening, hangers scraping on the rails. During that time, he sent emails to his lawyer, his bank, and his insurance company. By the time Morgan came downstairs 25 minutes later with her suitcase, he had already begun the divorce process. She stopped at the front door and turned to face him one last time. "This isn't over," she said. "You're right," he agreed. "This is just the beginning." The door closed behind her with a definitive click. Bryce stood in the emptiness of the house, feeling the weight of the future. But he had built his life from nothing before. He could do it again. His phone buzzed. Avery's friend's mother had texted, "Still okay to bring Avery home at noon?" He quickly confirmed, and then surveyed the house. It would soon be a battleground. He had work to do before his daughter returned. The world as she knew it had just been shattered, but he would make sure she had the strongest foundation possible to face what lay ahead. He began making lists, contractors to change the locks, meetings with lawyers, plans for new bank accounts. Morgan had chosen her path, and now she would learn the consequences of betraying Bryce Keller's trust. The morning sun rose over Denver, painting the sky in fiery hues. In a few hours, he would have to explain to his daughter that her mother had destroyed their family. But first, he had his own destruction to plan. The deliberate destruction of every luxury and convenience that Morgan had once enjoyed as Shane's wife was well underway. She had sought freedom, and he'd make sure she would get it, along with all the consequences that came with it. The early morning sunlight stretched long shadows across Shane Calloway's office as Bryce presented the evidence. Steam rose from untouched coffee cups as the divorce lawyer sifted through the photos, messages, and financial documents scattered across his polished mahogany desk. "Jesus Christ," Shane muttered, lifting a particularly incriminating photo from Alien Nights. "Your wife isn't just burning bridges, she's detonating nuclear bombs," he added. "Ex-wife," Bryce corrected him, his voice cool and professional, like the one he used when dismissing substandard materials. "Tell me everything that happened after you caught her," he continued. "Every detail is important." Bryce recounted the confrontation with precision, as if narrating blueprints. When he finished, Shane let out a low whistle. "You kept your cool. Smart move. Most guys would have lost it." "I don't lose control," Bryce replied, his tone calm. "Not even when everything's falling apart. That's why." Shane began organizing the documents into stacks. "You'll win. But we need to act fast. Women like Morgan become desperate when they're cornered." The intercom crackled, and Shane's secretary's voice came through. "Mr. Calloway, Mrs. Keller is here. She says she urgently needs to speak with you." "Perfect timing," Shane replied, his smile void of warmth. "Let's show her exactly what she's up against." Morgan stormed into the office, her designer heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She wore a formal business suit, a stark contrast to her usual stylish attire. She froze at the sight of Bryce. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice trembling despite her attempt at authority. "Securing my future," Bryce replied coldly. "And Avery's," he added. Morgan turned to Shane, regaining her composure. "I was hoping to hire you." "I'm afraid that would be a conflict of interest, Mrs. Keller," Shane said, offering a professional smile that could freeze hell. "I'm already representing your husband." "But you're the best divorce attorney in Denver," she insisted. Bryce answered quietly. "He is." Morgan's face turned red. "You orchestrated this. You're trying to destroy me." "No, Morgan. You managed that on your own." Bryce stood up, his voice calm. "I'm just making it official." "You can't do this to me," she cried. "Actually," Shane interjected, "he can. And based on this," he tapped the photos on his desk, "he will. I suggest you get yourself a lawyer quickly. You'll receive our initial filing within the hour." Morgan's composure faltered. "Bryce, please. We could talk about this," she pleaded. "Like you talked about it before? Sleeping with strangers? Betraying our marriage? Abandoning our daughter?" His words cut through her, sharp and final. "I made a mistake," she whispered. "No," Bryce replied, stepping closer, his presence commanding. "A mistake is ordering the wrong concrete mix. A mistake is misreading a blueprint. What you did was a choice. Multiple choices, multiple times. What about Avery?" Morgan's voice quivered. "You can't keep me from my daughter." "Watch me," Bryce said, turning to Shane. "Are we done here?" "Just getting started," Shane replied, gathering papers. "Mrs. Keller, I suggest you leave now and find a lawyer who enjoys losing." As Morgan reached the door, she spun around. "I'll fight you on this. I'll tell everyone what kind of controlling bastard you are." "Go ahead," Bryce's voice was steady. "Show the world who you really are. I have the evidence to show who you really are, too." Once she left, Shane turned to Bryce. "She'll try to paint you as abusive and controlling, the standard playbook for guilty spouses." "Let her try," Bryce replied, checking his phone. 3 missed calls from the construction site. Nobody who knows me will believe it. "Speaking of knowing people," Shane began, "we need to start gathering statements. Friends, neighbors, Avery's teachers. Build a picture of who's really been the responsible parent. Already started, Bryce said, handing Shane a prepared list with dates showing when Morgan missed Avery's events due to her partying. Shane looked it over, nodding in approval. Methodical. I like it. Now, about the financial aspect. Bryce's phone buzzed again, displaying a text from Mike at the construction site. Emergency at the medical center build. Need you here as soon as possible. Shane waved him off. I'll start the paperwork, but Bryce's face turned serious. The next few weeks will be hell. She'll try everything to break you. Sure, she tried that, Bryce replied, heading for the door. I don't break. At the construction site, chaos greeted him. A delivery of subpar materials threatened to delay the entire project. Bryce threw himself into the crisis, negotiating with suppliers, reorganizing schedules, and keeping his crew on track. As noon approached, Mike approached him. Your daughter's school is calling. Bryce stepped away from the noise. Avery? What's wrong? The school secretary's voice was hesitant. There's been an incident. Mrs. Keller tried to pick Avery up early, but when we said she wasn't on the approved list, she caused quite a scene. Define scene, Bryce demanded. She was yelling, demanding to see Avery. When we refused, she started crying and saying awful things about you to anyone who would listen. We had to call security. Is Avery okay? Bryce asked, his voice tight. Shaken up, but yes. We got her into the counselor's office. She's asking for you. I'll be there in 15 minutes, Bryce said, rushing to the school. He found Avery curled up in a chair, looking smaller than her 12 years. When she saw him, she jumped into his arms. Dad, she whispered, her voice cracking. Mom was yelling and crying and saying awful things about you. It's okay, sweetheart, he reassured her, holding her close. You're safe now. The school counselor, Mrs. Martinez, approached carefully. Mr. Keller, could we speak privately? Bryce nodded, then turned to Avery. Wait here, kiddo. I'll be right back. In the hallway, Mrs. Martinez spoke softly. Avery's very upset. Mrs. Keller was quite vocal about your private matters, telling other parents that you locked her out, froze her accounts, and turned everyone against her. All true, Bryce said flatly. After I caught her cheating with multiple partners and neglecting our daughter, Mrs. Martinez's eyes widened slightly. I see. Well, regardless of the situation between you and Mrs. Keller, Avery needs professional support. Already arranged, Bryce replied. Starting tomorrow with Dr. Chun, best child psychologist in Denver. Good, Mrs. Martinez said. And the custody situation? My lawyer's handling it. Morgan won't be allowed near the school again. That evening, after settling Avery at home with her favorite pizza and a movie, Bryce called Shane. Morgan tried to take Avery from school. Perfect. Shane's voice held satisfaction. Adds weight to our custody argument. I'll have the temporary restraining order ready by morning. How's Avery holding up? Bryce asked, watching his daughter from the doorway. She kept glancing at her phone. Scared, angry, he said. She needs stability. We'll get it for her, Shane replied. In the meantime, I've started the financial separation. Frozen all joint accounts, credit cards, everything. Morgan's about to find out what life costs when Daddy and Hubby aren't paying for it. Good. What's next? We hit her where it hurts. Reputation and finances. Speaking of which, Shane said, have you contacted her employer yet? Working on it, Bryce replied. The next morning, Bryce sat in his truck outside Crawford and Mills law firm. He'd prepared carefully, gathering every piece of evidence showing that Morgan had used company time, resources, and her position at the firm to arrange her affairs. Melinda Crane's office, with its old money decor and high standards, matched the atmosphere of the managing partner's office. As she sat behind her massive desk, her expression grew darker as she reviewed the evidence. Bryce began by stating that she had taken off her glasses, gradually unsettling Mrs. Keller, who had used their firm's reputation to organize illicit encounters. Bryce finished bluntly, asserting that this occurred during company hours, using company resources, along with photos taken at a private club called Elian Nights, where she went while claiming to be working late. He pointed out the timestamps on her emails, showing her scheduling these meetings during office hours. Melinda's lips tightened. She picked up one email that was especially incriminating, revealing that she had used their client contact list to network at such events. Bryce kept his tone professional, noting that they would also find expense reports where she had submitted claims for client dinners, which were actually charges for hotel stays. Melinda sat up straighter in her chair. I want you to know that Crawford and Mills takes these matters seriously. We have a reputation to protect. Bryce met her gaze. So do I. That's why I'm here. He assured her they would begin an immediate investigation. Meanwhile, Mrs. Keller would be placed on unpaid leave, and as for Mr. Keller, she held up the photos. Thank you for bringing this to our attention quietly. I appreciate your time. Bryce stood up to leave, but Melinda's voice stopped him. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. Morgan has seemed different recently. Now I know why. Back at the construction site, Bryce threw himself into work. The physical labor, every nail hammered and beam secured, felt like progress. Around noon, his phone buzzed with messages from Morgan. How dare you go to my boss? You're trying to ruin me. I'll make you regret this. Everything I did was on my own time. You had no right to show those pictures. Bryce blocked her number without responding. Mike approached cautiously. Boss, you've got a visitor. Piper, Morgan's closest friend since college, stood outside his office trailer. Her face reflected the inner conflict of someone torn between loyalties. Bryce, she twisted her hands nervously. I needed to know. Morgan told me what happened. Did she tell you everything, Piper, or just her version? Bryce asked. She said you were trying to ruin her life, that you're being cruel and vindictive, Piper responded. Bryce showed her the photos from Elian Nights on his phone. Piper's face turned pale. Oh my God, she whispered, sinking heavily onto the trailer steps. She said she was working late. She said the new clothes were for client meetings. I believed her, we all did. Bryce nodded. That's how betrayal works. Piper shook her head. We've been friends since college. But the way she's been acting lately, the things she's saying about you and these pictures. She looked up, tears in her eyes. What about Avery? What about her? Bryce's voice grew firm. While Morgan was out destroying our family, who was taking care of our daughter? Who was at her games, her appointments, her school events? Piper was visibly distressed. I'm so sorry, Bryce. I had no idea. The things she's telling everyone, she's saying you're abusive, that you controlled all the money. That's what guilty people do, Piper. They try to make themselves the victim. Piper wiped her eyes. I can't support this. She stood. Morgan needs to know there are consequences for her actions. Bryce nodded. Then tell her. Tell everyone who will listen. The truth always comes out anyway. Later that afternoon, Shane called with updates. A temporary restraining order is in place. Morgan can't come within 500 feet of your home or Avery's school, and I've got statements from 3 of your neighbors about her erratic behavior. Bryce glanced at his crew securing support beams. What's the timeline? Shane replied. The first hearing is next week, but Bryce... His voice grew serious. Morgan's hired Patricia Winters. Should I know that name? Bryce asked. She's aggressive, likes to play dirty in the media. She specializes in turning cheating spouses into sympathetic victims. Prepare for things to get ugly. It's too late for that, Bryce muttered, ending the call. That evening, as Bryce helped Avery with her homework, the doorbell rang. Linda Hansen, Morgan's mother, stood on the porch, her face tight with disapproval. Where's my daughter? She demanded. Not here, Bryce replied, moving to shut the door. Don't you dare shut me out, Linda pushed forward. Morgan's devastated. She's been crying for days, living in a cheap motel because you froze all her accounts. What kind of man treats his wife like this? The kind whose wife sleeps with strangers while neglecting their child, Bryce responded coldly. Want to see the proof? He held up the photos and messages. Linda recoiled. What are you talking about? Ask your daughter, Bryce retorted. Ask her about Elian Nights. Ask her what she was doing with 3 men while our daughter was sick at school. Ask her why she used our money to buy lingerie for her affairs. No, Linda said, backing away in shock. You're lying. A small voice from behind them interrupted. Dad? Avery stood at the door. Linda tried to move past Bryce. Avery, sweetheart, your mother needs you. She's so sorry for everything. If you'd just talk to her. Avery stepped back. I don't want to talk about Mom. She hurt Dad. She hurt everyone. Avery, please. Linda reached for her granddaughter, but Avery pulled away. If she loved me, she wouldn't have done those things. Linda's face crumpled. What men? What are you talking about? Get out! Bryce's voice was sharp, cutting through the air. Now before I call the police. After Linda left, Bryce found Avery in her room, hugging her knees. You okay, kiddo? He asked softly. Why does everyone want me to forgive Mom? Avery's voice was small. I don't want to. You don't have to, Bryce said, sitting beside her. Some things don't deserve forgiveness. Like what Mom did. Exactly like what Mom did. The next few days brought more attempts at reconciliation. Morgan sent flowers to Bryce's office, but he had them thrown away. She tried reaching out to Avery through friends, but he blocked those attempts as well. She even showed up at the construction site, causing a scene until security had to remove her. Mr. Keller's secretary, caught between meetings, informed him that Mrs. Keller's lawyer wanted to discuss a settlement. Tell them to talk to Shane, Bryce said, checking his watch. I've got a concrete pour to oversee. Patricia Winters wasn't easily discouraged. She cornered Bryce outside the courthouse after a preliminary hearing. Mr. Keller, she smiled predatorily. Let's talk reasonably. Morgan's willing to negotiate. She knows she made mistakes. Save it, Bryce replied, walking away. Everything goes through Shane. Don't you think you're being harsh? She asked. Counseling! Your client destroyed our marriage, traumatized our daughter, and spent our money on her affairs. Now she's reaping what she sowed. Bryce's voice was unwavering. The courts don't look kindly on vindictive husbands, and they don't look kindly on unfaithful wives who neglect their children. Want to test which looks worse? Patricia's smile tightened. We have evidence of your controlling behavior. The way you monitored her spending, tracked her movements. You mean the way I discovered she was using our money to fund her affairs? Bryce stepped closer. Go ahead. Take this to court. Show everyone exactly who Morgan really is. I've got nothing to hide. She's willing to accept reduced alimony, Patricia tried. If she'll get something. She'll get nothing, Bryce responded as he began walking away. Tell her. To experience her freedom, she paid a heavy price. That afternoon, Shane called with an update. Morgan had been officially let go from Crawford and Mills. Their investigation uncovered multiple breaches of company policy, and she received no severance. Bryce was going over construction plans while they spoke. What else? He asked. Her lawyers are pushing hard for mediation, Shane replied. She wants to avoid a public trial and is willing to drop her custody claims if we agree to a generous alimony. Not happening. Bryce's voice was firm. I knew you'd say that. Shane paused. By the way, the photos we sent to her social circle are working wonders. Her friend Piper just called, offering to testify about Morgan's behavior. Piper has texts proving Morgan lied about working late. Send me Piper's statement, Bryce replied. I want to review it personally. A knock on his office trailer door interrupted them. Mike stood there, looking uneasy. Boss, Morgan's mother is here. She says she needs to talk to you about Avery. Bryce ended his call with Shane. Send her in. Linda Hansen looked different from her last visit to INF, more deflated, older. She sank heavily into the chair across from his desk. I spoke to Morgan, she said quietly. I saw the evidence, the photos, those terrible messages. Her voice cracked. How could she do this to you? To Avery. Ask your daughter, Bryce replied, keeping his attention on the blueprints. She seems to have all the answers lately. She's staying with me now. Linda twisted her wedding ring, a nervous habit Morgan had inherited. The motel. She couldn't afford it after you froze the accounts. She's not managing well. Not my problem, Bryce said flatly. Please, she's still Avery's mother. A mother, Bryce snapped, doesn't skip her daughter's soccer finals for sex parties. A mother doesn't use family money to buy lingerie for strangers. A mother doesn't destroy her child's life for fun. Linda flinched. She needs help. She needs consequences. Bryce stood up. Unless this is about Avery's welfare, we're done here. She's talking about leaving Denver, or starting fresh somewhere else. Linda's voice trembled. She can't lose Avery. She already did, Bryce shot back. Her choice, her consequences. After Linda left, Bryce drove to Avery's school for a meeting with her teachers. The recent turmoil had affected her grades, but her support system was strong. Avery's resilient, assured Mrs. Martinez, the counselor. But she needs consistency. She has that with me. Bryce glanced over Avery's latest progress reports. What else does she need? He asked. Time. Space to process. The counselor hesitated. She mentioned wanting to write a letter to her mother, not to send, just to express her feelings. Whatever helps her heal. That evening, Bryce found Avery in her room, working on homework. She looked up as he entered. "Dad, is it true Mom might leave Denver?" "Who told you that?" he asked. "Jenny from soccer. She heard Mom talking about it." Bryce sat on the edge of her bed. "Would it bother you if she did?" Avery was silent for a long moment. "She's already gone, isn't she? The Mom I knew before. She's not coming back." "No, kiddo, she's not." Avery's voice hardened, sounding just like him. "I don't want her back." In the following weeks, the battles continued. Morgan's lawyer filed motions challenging the frozen accounts, alleging financial abuse. Shane countered with evidence of her misuse of marital funds. Patricia Winters, Morgan's attorney, tried a new strategy, leaking stories to local gossip columns about Bryce's controlling behavior and Morgan's pursuit of freedom. The stories quickly faded when Shane released evidence of Morgan's infidelity to the same publications. "She's getting desperate," Shane warned during their weekly meeting. "Desperate people make mistakes." He was right. Morgan's next move proved it. She showed up at Avery's soccer practice, crying and causing a scene, which ended with the police being called. "I just wanted to see my daughter," she screamed as officers escorted her away. "He can't keep her from me. I'm her mother." Avery, watching from the team bench, turned to Bryce. "Can we go home now?" The incident only strengthened their custody case. Morgan's public meltdown, captured on other parents' phones, painted a clear picture for the court. "The judge will love this," Shane said, reviewing the police report. "It shows exactly why she shouldn't have unsupervised visits." Bryce focused on rebuilding their lives. He hired contractors to renovate parts of the house, removing any remnants of Morgan. Avery helped pick new colors for the living room, making it their own space. The community rallied around them. Neighbors who had witnessed Morgan's decline brought food and offered support. Avery's teachers kept a close eye on her at school. Even Morgan's old friends began distancing themselves as more of her behavior came to light. Mr. Keller's secretary handed him a thick envelope, the latest paperwork from Mr. Kelway. Inside were statements from Morgan's former colleagues at Crawford and Mills, detailing her misuse of company resources. There were also statements from neighbors about strange men visiting the house while Bryce was at work, and bank records showing thousands spent on hotels and clothing. The evidence piled up, each piece reinforcing their case. Morgan made one last attempt at reconciliation, waiting outside Bryce's office trailer late one evening. "Bryce, please." She looked different, thinner, less polished. "I'll do anything. Counseling, therapy, whatever you want." "I want nothing from you," he replied, moving past her toward his truck. "Not anymore." "I made a mistake," she said. "You made a choice," he shot back, fixing her with a cold stare. "Every time you lied, every time you cheated, every time you abandoned our daughter. Those were choices. Now live with them." "I'll lose everything," she whispered. "You already did," Bryce responded. "You just didn't notice until it hurt." The final hearing loomed like a storm on the horizon. Morgan's lawyer made desperate offers. She'd accept minimal support, give up claims to the house, and agree to supervised visitation only. "She's running scared," Shane observed. "No, she's lost," Bryce replied, watching the sunset over his construction site. "Let her run, as long as she runs far from us." The Denver sky darkened, promising a storm, but Bryce Keller had built his life to withstand any weather. The same could not be said for the woman who had betrayed him. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Bryce Keller ascended them, each step echoing with purpose. His usual work boots had been replaced with polished dress shoes, and his construction attire had been swapped for a tailored suit that spoke of success rather than surrender. Inside his jacket pocket, he carried the evidence that would destroy Morgan's future. Shane Calloway walked beside him, carrying a briefcase full of documentation of Morgan's betrayals. The lawyer's face showed the confidence of a man with a perfect case. "Everything's in place," Shane said, adjusting his tie. "Every witness, every document, every piece of evidence. She won't know what hit her." Bryce's voice mirrored his when inspecting foundation work, calm, precise, and calculating. The courtroom doors opened to reveal Morgan and her lawyer, Patricia Wires, already seated at the opposite table. Morgan wore a conservative blue dress, her hair and makeup meticulously done to project the image of the respectable wife she had never been. Her eyes met Bryce's, but he looked right through her, as if she were invisible. "Remember," Shane whispered as they sat down, "she'll try to play the victim. Let her. The evidence tells the real story." Judge Eleanor Matthews entered, known for her no-nonsense rulings, and the proceedings began. She presented herself with the confidence of someone who had encountered every trick, heard all the excuses, and had no tolerance for either. "Before we begin," she addressed the court, "I understand that Mrs. Keller's counsel has a final settlement proposal." Patricia Winters stood, smoothing out her skirt. "Yes, Your Honor. My client is prepared to accept a reduced alimony and supervised visitation in exchange for no further deals." Bryce's voice sliced through the courtroom like a razor. "Let the evidence speak for itself." Judge Matthews raised an eyebrow. "Very well, Mr. Calloway, you may proceed." Shane approached the bench, holding the first stack of documents. "Your Honor, we will demonstrate a pattern of infidelity, financial misconduct, and parental neglect that renders Mrs. Keller unfit for any custody consideration." "Objection," Patricia interrupted, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. "My client's personal life has no bearing on her ability to care for her child." "Overruled," Judge Matthews said, narrowing his gaze. "Continue, Mr. Calloway." The evidence unfolded like a blueprint for devastation. Shane began with the financial records. Bank statements showing thousands spent on hotels and lingerie. Credit card bills from stores no working mother should afford. Expense reports listed 4 business meetings that were actually rendezvous with lovers. "As you can see, Your Honor," Shane pointed to the highlighted figures, "Mrs. Keller spent over $30,000 of marital funds on her extramarital activities in just 6 months. Morgan shifted in her seat as the judge examined the documents. Patricia leaned over, urgently whispering in her client's ear, but Morgan brushed her off. Shane continued, presenting a new file. "We also have evidence that Mrs. Keller exploited her position at Crawford and Mills law firm to facilitate her affairs." "Objection!" Patricia leapt up. "My client's employment status is irrelevant." "It's entirely relevant," Shane countered. "It shows a pattern of deception that goes beyond her marriage. Mrs. Keller used company resources to arrange her affairs, falsely claimed personal expenses as business costs, and lied to her employers just as she did to her family." The next set of evidence hit even harder. Emails from Morgan's work account arranged meetings during business hours, using the firm's client database to network at her private parties. Shane then presented a letter on Crawford and Mills' letterhead, the official termination notice, outlining Mrs. Keller's misconduct and the company's findings during their investigation. Judge Matthews reviewed the document carefully. "Mrs. Keller, these allegations are incredibly serious." Morgan stood, her voice trembling yet defiant. "Your Honor, I made mistakes, but I am still a good mother. I love my daughter." Shane produced another file, thick with school records. "This shows every missed parent-teacher conference, every skipped soccer game, and every ignored school event, all while Mrs. Keller pursued her extracurricular activities." He outlined a timeline that matched the dates of Morgan's hotel receipts with Avery's important events. The pattern was undeniable. While their daughter scored goals and won awards, Morgan was entertaining strangers in downtown hotels. The most troubling evidence came next. Shane pulled out a specific incident report. On this day in October, Avery was sick at school, running a fever of 102 degrees. The school tried reaching Mrs. Keller for 3 hours. Where was she? According to these hotel receipts and time-stamped photos, she was at the Westin with 2 different men. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Morgan's face had gone pale, but her eyes flashed with anger. "Your Honor," she stood again, "this is character assassination. Bryce is trying to destroy me, turn everyone against me, freeze my accounts, ruin my career." Judge Matthews' voice cut through her hysteria. "You seem to be confusing consequences with persecution. Please sit down." The next witness made Morgan sink deeper into her chair. Melinda Crane, her former boss at Crawford and Mills, took the stand with the dignity of old money and high standards. "Mrs. Keller was terminated for cause," Melinda stated firmly. "She used company resources for intimate meetings, falsified expense reports, and brought disrepute to our firm." Shane asked, "How did her performance change in recent months?" "It declined significantly," Melinda replied coolly. Late arrivals, early departures, long lunches that coincided with hotel charges on her company card. When confronted, she became defensive, aggressive even. Patricia tried to salvage the situation with a cross-examination. Miss Crane, isn't it true that my client was one of your most valued employees before all this? She was adequate, Melinda replied, until she decided her personal appetites were more important than professional integrity. The morning session ended with Morgan's reputation shattered. During the lunch break, she cornered Bryce in the courthouse hallway. "How could you do this to me?" she whispered fiercely. "Destroying everything I've worked for." Bryce looked at her as if she were a cracked foundation, something deeply flawed. "You did this to yourself. Every lie, every betrayal, every choice was yours. I'll never forgive you for this." His smile held no warmth. I was about to say the same thing. The afternoon session began with Morgan's attempt at redemption. Patricia called character witnesses, friends who spoke of Morgan's better days, and colleagues who remembered her professional competence. But under Shane's cross-examination, each was forced to admit knowledge of her recent behavior. One friend admitted, albeit reluctantly, that Morgan had bragged about her conquests at Alien Nights. "Did she ever express remorse?" Shane pressed. "No," the friend answered. "She said she deserved some excitement after being married to such a boring man." Morgan's face crumpled as her friend betrayed her, just as she had betrayed her family. The most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source. Piper, Morgan's oldest friend, stepped forward voluntarily. She took the stand with determination. "I've known Morgan for 15 years, Piper began. "I was her best friend through college, marriage, everything. The woman she's become, that's not the Morgan I knew. That's someone who chose thrills over family, lies over loyalty." Shane asked, "Can you elaborate?" "She started changing months ago. New clothes, new attitudes. She'd lie about working late, but I'd see her car at hotel parking lots. When I confronted her, she laughed it off, said Bryce was boring, that she deserved more excitement. And her relationship with Avery? She missed Avery's 12th birthday party for what she claimed was a work emergency." Piper's voice hardened. "I later found out she was at Alien Night. She chose strangers over her own daughter's birthday." Morgan stood abruptly. "You promised you'd never tell anyone about that. And you promised to be faithful to your husband." Piper shot back. "Guess we both broke promises." The judge slammed her gavel. "Mrs. Keller, sit down. Miss Hart, please continue." "I'm here because someone needs to tell the truth. Morgan's not a victim," Piper said. "She's someone who threw away her family for thrills, and now she can't handle the consequences." As Piper stepped down, Morgan's lawyer made a final attempt at damage control. "Your Honor, my client acknowledges her mistakes. She's willing to undergo counseling, accept supervised visitation." Shane nodded to the court clerk, who dimmed the lights. A video from Avery's soccer practice played on the courtroom screen. Morgan's public meltdown, her erratic behavior, and the police intervention. "This incident," Shane explained, "occurred after a temporary restraining order had already been put in place. Mrs. Keller violated a court order to cause this disturbance at a children's sporting event." The video showed Morgan screaming at coaches and parents, trying to shield their children, while police officers finally led her away. Through it all, Avery sat on the team bench, her face buried in her hands. When the lights came back on, even Patricia Winter looked defeated. The next witness was closer to home. Linda Hansen, Morgan's mother, took the stand with visible reluctance. Shane gently asked, "When did you first notice changes in your daughter's behavior?" Linda twisted her wedding ring nervously, a habit Morgan had inherited. "About 8 months ago. She started dressing differently, staying out late. When I asked about Bryce and Avery, she changed the subject." Now Linda's voice trembled as she admitted that she's staying in my extra room because she can't afford a place of her own. "She goes out at all hours and comes back reeking of bars. When I try to discuss Avery, she gets upset, claiming everyone is against her. Has she shown any regret for her actions?" "No." Linda's confessions clearly cause her discomfort, but she continues saying she deserves to be happy and that everyone is trying to control her. She stared directly at her daughter, unable to grasp that happiness shouldn't come at the expense of tearing apart your family. The final witness was Dr. Chun, Avery's therapist. With a composed professional demeanor, she discussed Avery's emotional struggles. The child is dealing with abandonment issues, Doctor, Chun explained. She feels betrayed not only by her mother's infidelity, but also by the consistent pattern of Mrs. Keller choosing other pursuits over spending time with her daughter. As for Avery's relationship with her father, Mr. Keller, he has been a steady and reliable source of support, and Avery sees him as her secure foundation, the parent she can trust to put her needs first. Patricia's cross-examination was brief and ineffective. After Dr. Chun stepped down, Judge Matthews called for a short break to review all the evidence. In the hallway, Morgan made one last plea for reconciliation. "Please," she whispered to Bryce, "don't do this to me. We can work something out." His voice, cold as ice, cut through the air. "You made your choice, Morgan. Live with it." "I'll lose everything," she cried. "You already lost everything," he shot back. "You just didn't care until it hurt." Back in the courtroom, Judge Matthews made her ruling with a decisive finality. "This court has thoroughly reviewed all the evidence," she began, "and what is clear is a consistent pattern of misconduct, neglect, and harmful behavior that cannot be overlooked." Morgan clenched the table, her knuckles white. "Mrs. Keller has demonstrated not only infidelity, which on its own might not affect custody, but also a repeated prioritization of her own pleasure over her child's well-being. The documented incidents reveal a parent who continually chose adult gatherings over her daughter's important events, used family funds for extramarital affairs, and has shown no sincere remorse for her actions." The judge shuffled her papers and continued, "Therefore, I grant full custody of Avery Keller to her father, Bryce Keller. Mrs. Keller's visitation rights will be determined after she completes mandatory counseling and a substance abuse screening." Morgan's cry reverberated through the courtroom. "You can't," she protested. "Furthermore," the judge raised her voice, "given Mrs. Keller's misuse of marital funds and her dismissal for cause from her employment, no alimony will be granted. The family home and all major assets will remain with Mr. Keller." Patricia grabbed Morgan's arm as she swayed. "This court's decision is final," Judge Matthews declared. The gavel fell with a finality that echoed like the closing of a coffin. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded like vultures, but Shane handled them while Bryce walked toward his truck. His victory felt complete, but it had the taste of ashes. His phone buzzed. Avery had texted him. "How did it go?" he typed back. "Coming to pick you up, we won." That evening, they sat at their favorite pizza place. Avery, picking at her slice, asked, "Dad, is Mom really going to leave Denver?" He kept his voice steady. "Probably. That's her choice. Just like everything else has been her choice." Avery nodded thoughtfully. In the weeks after the trial, Morgan's attempts to reach out dwindled and eventually ceased. Bryce learned through mutual friends that she had moved to Phoenix, starting over where her reputation didn't follow her. Meanwhile, Bryce threw himself into new projects, each one a testament to his ability to create. As for Morgan, she had lost everything she had destroyed. One bright morning, Bryce stood reviewing plans for a major new development. His client, Quinn Adler, a talented architect he had known since high school, had recently returned to Denver. A single mother with fresh ideas and steady hands, she pointed to the blueprint. "These support columns," she said. "We could modify them to let in more natural light while maintaining structural integrity." Bryce studied the design. Her ideas were innovative yet sound. Avery burst into the office trailer, her excitement palpable. "I made the advanced team. The coach says I'm starting forward." Quinn smiled at her enthusiasm. "Sounds like congratulations are in order." Avery, noticing the blueprints, asked, "Are you two building something cool?" Quinn laughed. "Trying to. Your dad's pretty picky about his designs," she said. "That's because he builds things right," Avery responded proudly. "Not like—" She trailed off, but Bryce finished her sentence with a smile. "Not like people who take shortcuts." Avery smiled back. "Exactly. Ready for ice cream?" Bryce asked. Quinn's smile was genuine. "I'd like that." In the months that followed, Quinn became a regular presence in their lives. She brought fresh perspectives to Bryce's projects and stability to their personal lives. Her son, Jake, and Avery bonded over soccer and video games. Healing happened slowly, in small moments. Avery's grades improved, and she smiled more, laughed more easily. The shadow of Morgan's betrayal began to fade. One evening, while helping Avery with her homework, Bryce noticed she was working on a family tree project. Dad? She hesitated. Do I have to put Mom on this? He replied gently. Your choice, kiddo. Some branches of the tree might be dead, but that doesn't mean we can't grow new ones. Avery thought for a moment, then added new lines to the tree, including Quinn in their family circle. Later that week, a package arrived at the house. Inside, Bryce found their old wedding photo, shredded into pieces, with a note in his handwriting. You wanted freedom. Enjoy it. He had written it weeks earlier, waiting for the right moment. Now, watching Avery laugh at something Quinn said while they worked on her science project, Bryce knew he had timed it perfectly. Morgan had destroyed their world, but from those ashes, he and Avery were building something stronger. 3 months later, Bryce stood in his new office at the expanded construction company headquarters. Through the window, he could see Avery playing soccer with Jake in the park across the street. Quinn sat on a bench, sketching new designs while keeping an eye on the kids. His phone buzzed. An unknown number. I miss her, please, just let me talk to her, the text read. Bryce deleted it without responding. Some bridges, once burned, should stay that way. Quinn knocked on his door, holding fresh blueprints. Ready to review the new project? She asked. Bryce was always ready to build something worthwhile. The days turned into weeks, then months. Morgan's absence became permanent, her presence fading like old photographs left in the sun. Across town, in the small grocery store where she now worked, Morgan rang up customers' purchases, her designer clothes and expensive jewelry long gone. One afternoon, she saw Bryce's truck pass by, with Avery laughing in the passenger seat, and a woman Morgan didn't recognize beside her. They looked happy, a complete family that Morgan had destroyed, but which had rebuilt itself without her. Ma'am, a customer's voice interrupted, snapping Morgan back to the present. Her hands trembled as she counted out change. From being an executive assistant at a prestigious law firm to working as a cashier in a grocery store, her fall had been swift and complete. Back at Keller Construction headquarters, Bryce reviewed the latest project proposals with his team. The company had doubled in size since the divorce, expanding into new markets across Colorado. The hospital renovation contract had come through, Mike announced during their morning meeting. Biggest project yet, he added, as Quinn spread the preliminary designs. Across the conference table, I have a few ideas for the children's wing. Something to make it feel less intimidating for the kids. Bryce examined the plans, appreciating how she had integrated natural light and open spaces. As always, Quinn's designs reflected careful thought and consideration for others. Just then, Avery poked her head into the room, asking, Can Jay come over for dinner? His mom's working late on the hospital designs. Bryce glanced at his watch. Sure, he said. Quinn, why don't you join us when you're done? No need to eat alone. These unplanned family dinners had become a common occurrence, a stark contrast to the tense meals at the end of his marriage. These evenings were filled with laughter and meaningful conversations. That night, while watching Quinn assist Avery and Jake with their science project, Bryce realized he was experiencing something he hadn't expected to feel again. His phone buzzed with another text from Morgan. Saw you today. All of you. She looks happy. I hope you're proud of what you've taken from me. Bryce showed the message to Quinn after the kids were in bed. She still doesn't get it, does she? Quinn murmured. She gave it away. You didn't take anything. Some people never take responsibility. Bryce deleted the message. They just keep looking for someone else to blame. The following week brought Morgan's final attempt at control. She showed up at Avery's soccer game, standing just beyond the restraining order's boundary. Mom's here, Avery said tightly, spotting her across the field. Can we go home? No, Bryce replied firmly. You've worked too hard for this game. Don't let her take that from you too. Quinn moved to sit between Morgan's line of sight and Avery. Want me to call security? No need, Bryce said, narrowing his eyes as he watched his ex-wife. She's not worth the effort. Morgan left before halftime, but not before seeing Avery score 2 goals. Not before watching Quinn celebrate with her stepdaughter. Morgan realized what she had thrown away could never be reclaimed. Later that evening, Bryce found Avery in her room, holding an old family photo. Do you think she ever loved us? Avery asked quietly. Really loved us? Bryce sat beside her. I think she loved the idea of us. Real love takes work and commitment. Your mom wanted the easy parts without the responsibility, like building something cheap that falls apart. Exactly like that, Avery said softly. The next morning, they received news that Morgan had quit her job at the grocery store, packed up from her mother's house, and left Denver for good. Linda called, her voice mixed with sadness and relief. There's nothing left for her here, Linda said. She's moving to California to start fresh. Good, Bryce replied. Fresh starts are easier when you're far from the wreckage you've caused. Life moved on. Keller Construction broke ground on the hospital project. Quinn's designs received awards, and Avery's soccer team made it to the state championships. One evening, as summer faded into autumn, Bryce stood in his office, watching the sunset paint the Denver skyline behind him. Quinn wrapped her arms around his waist. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked. "Just thinking about foundations," he replied. "How you have to completely tear out the damaged ones before you can build something strong." She understood, as she always did. "And have you built something strong?" she asked. He turned to face her. This woman had helped him and Avery rebuild from the ashes of Morgan's betrayal, growing stronger each day. Through the window, they could see Avery and Jake playing basketball in the office parking lot. Their laughter echoed, a sound Morgan would never hear. Across the city, in a small apartment above a convenience store, Morgan packed the last of her belongings into an old car. Her mother's final words echoed in her mind. "You did this to yourself, Morgan. Everyone you blame, they're just witnesses to your choices." As she drove past Keller Construction one last time, she saw the new sign being installed. Keller and Adler Construction Partners. Another piece of her old life had been transformed into something she could no longer touch. Stopped at a red light, she watched a group of women enter a nightclub, younger versions of who she had once been, chasing thrills that would cost them everything. She turned away, finally understanding that freedom wasn't free. Every choice had its price, and she had paid with everything she had once held dear. Back at the office, Bryce approved the final plans for the hospital's children's wing. Each signature was another step in building the foundation of their new life, one based on strength, trust, and the understanding that some betrayals can never be forgiven. The Denver sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of judgment. Morgan had chosen her path, and now she would walk it alone through the ruins of the life she destroyed. Meanwhile, Bryce and Avery built something stronger from the ashes. The new branch of Keller and Adler Construction rose against the Denver skyline, its steel and glass facade reflecting the morning sun. Inside his corner office, Bryce reviewed proposals with Quinn. Their professional partnership had evolved into something neither had expected, but both embraced. Avery, now starting high school, had grown into a confident young woman. The shadow of her mother's betrayal had faded, replaced by the unwavering love of a father and a stepmother, who had proven that family was about more than blood. Somewhere in California, Morgan Keller had become Morgan Davis again. She worked as a receptionist in a small real estate office.